Hello, everybody, both here and online. Being that we're just less than 2 weeks away from Passover, so I thought appropriate to talk about some of the universal lessons of this holiday. It goes back over 3,300 years ago. Maybe the most popular and famous event that continues to be commemorated year after year. And at the same time, many people, many Jews, and it's become even popular among the non-Jewish world, films like The Ten Commandments, Prince of Egypt, and many other films that have been influenced by this Exodus story. Many movements, emancipation movements, and dealing with slavery in our modern times have always looked to Exodus as being the first documented, institutionalized slavery of a people by another people. And the freedom has always been an inspiration to people all over the world. Even this country, the United States, you may or not be aware, but the founding fathers saw the foundation of the United States of America as being like the promised land. They even considered Hebrew to be the original formal language of this country. It just was not practical. And they saw the freedom and the Declaration of Independence and the emancipation very much parallel to what they saw as being freeing themselves from the oppression, and in this case of King George, and the overtaxation and being controlled by other forces, which is really the essence of independence and freedom and democracy as we know it, which interestingly is only a few hundred years old. The story of Exodus is over 3,300 years old. So this is not the place to discuss it, but the question is, why did it take so long? From a story of freedom and the rights that human beings have is to choose their own destiny, and the freedom of religion and freedom of expression and all the Bill of Rights that we know, why did it take over 3,000 years for the world to catch up and finally establish this type of, that something we take as a given today, which is freedom? That's why I find that there's tremendous lessons that you can learn from the story of Exodus, even though it happened so long ago, because it's one of the forces, the biggest inspirations for modern freedom. And though, yes, at the time it was the Egyptians who enslaved and persecuted the Jewish people, but the lessons are not just about the Egyptians and the Jews, it's lessons for human beings in general. The idea of does a nation, does a people have a right to enslave another people? And this is going to be applied to black slavery, it can be applied to slavery that even goes on today in different countries, including in Africa and other places, and it can apply to any type of injustice where one group or one individual imposes themselves upon others. So the story of Exodus, the story of Egypt, the story of Passover is really, if you think about it, a very universal one that has tremendous lessons, I just spoke on a collective level, but it's also true on a personal level. The focus I usually place in this class is on the spiritual and the psychological and emotional application of ideas that may sometimes seem parochial, and the same thing with discussing Passover, as applying that not just to the collective idea of freedom, but also to the individual sense of freedom. Are we a free people? So technically speaking, yes, we don't have the oppression that our ancestors had, as I said, prior to 300-400 years ago, where the entire world was ruled by monarchs or the church or individuals that your life and my life would have been completely under their mercy. The establishment of the United States and subsequently other democracies and other free countries around the world, which has only been growing ever since, is the basic principles that the government does not have the right, there's no king, there's no monarch, there's no one that has the control over human beings, that we choose who governs us, and we have the right to replace them, and all the other rights that I mentioned before that are enumerated in our Bill of Rights or in the Magna Carta and earlier documents that evolved ultimately. But today, this has become a given. It was not a given this way 3,300 years ago. So when you look back there, you can learn many lessons. What exactly was it that the Bible and the Torah describes that really introduced this concept of freedom? And as I said, there's both a collective discussion, which I've discussed many times. I'm going to focus a little more on the personal here, because there's an interesting concept in Jewish thought which is called microcosm, macrocosm. Everything that exists on the macrocosmic level exists on the microcosm level. To put it in poetic terms, the human being is a small universe. In Hebrew, Elam Katan Za Adam. And the universe is a large organism. Today, this is not metaphorical. Today, we actually see it. And from a scientific point of view, you see whether it's on a DNA level or cellular structure. Excuse me. Whatever it may be, you also see on that subatomic level that everything is made up of the same atoms. Different combinations, but it all goes down to the same building blocks that define existence. So this is a concept that goes back as well several thousand years, the idea of microcosm and macrocosm, which is that whatever exists on the larger universal level also exists in the personal level, which leads us to a very powerful statement made by Maimonides some 1,000 years ago, where he writes that a human being, when they make choices, daily choices that we make all the time, should always envision that the world and your personal life, everything is on an equal scale, where the good and the evil are balance each other out, cancel each other out. And therefore, one act that you do can tip the scale. So even though there's 7 billion people on the planet, and we have many, many choices we make, but if we look at it on an individual basis, every choice by choice, move by move, that every time you make a choice, you can tip the scale for positive or for negative, that gives both a sense of empowerment as well as a sense of motivation. Because when you think in terms of 7 billion people, what difference does it really make? A drop in the bucket. You know, they give that analogy of a great king who notified that certain small town that he's going to come visit the town. And this was a great celebration because they never had the opportunity to host their great leader. But the town were made up of very poor people. And they wanted to do some type of gesture of gratitude and show the king their appreciation for his visit. So they got together and they came up with an idea. Since the king will know that we're not wealthy, we don't have any real resources, we'll put a big barrel in the middle of the big courtyard, the big city square, town square, and every family is expected to pour in a goblet, a bottle of wine, and we'll give him this big barrel of wine, and based on our status, this will be like a sign of appreciation and gratitude. Surely be appreciated because wine was expensive and not everyone could afford it. But this is what we'll all do. Now, of course, the smart people in town said to themselves, you know what? Listen, there's hundreds of other families. Wine is expensive. Why do I have to pour a bottle of wine? I'll pour a bottle of water. One bottle of water. Everyone else is pouring wine. No one can tell. There'll still be mostly wine. The problem was that everybody in town had the same idea. So instead of pouring wine, nobody poured wine. Everybody poured water. So instead of giving him a barrel of wine, they gave the king a barrel of water. This is when people don't feel that their actions are significant. You know, what's the big thing? I'm one person in the big scheme of things. Like one grain of sand on a beach. What significance does it have? But the significance for that grain of sand is significance. And in Jewish thought in particular, which goes back, you talk about the Bill of Rights, every individual life is sacred, and every individual journey is dignified and deserves to be appreciated because in the large cosmic plan, everyone is necessary and indispensable. When Mozart reportedly presented one of his great symphonies to the Archduke of Austria, so the Archduke, who thought he was some type of connoisseur of music, listened to it and then said to Mozart, Mozart, it's beautiful, but far too many notes. That's what he decided. There were too many notes in the symphony. So Mozart purportedly responded and said, yes, Your Majesty, but not one more than necessary. So when we don't understand necessarily the mystery of existence, so someone can come to a beautiful, majestic palace and say, hey, what do we need all these rooms for? This is extra, this is... But when someone understands the design and realizes that if you just touch even one cell, you tamper with think of a computer program. You see millions of lines of programming and someone just adds a dot. What's the big thing? A dot. Or you take out a dot, the whole thing can wreak havoc. You can destroy the whole program and even worse. So details do matter and every detail counts. So in that sense, Every individual act is the way we look at it. That's why the microcosm affects the macrocosm. To say we can't have an impact on the world is absolutely incorrect. And Jewish thought always taught this idea, the power of the individual. And that's why individual rights were so significant. It wasn't just the good of the community outweighs the good of the individual. It's never the case. The community, the synergy of a community is only there to enhance individuality, not to replace it. If you want to start making comparisons between Marxism and socialism and other schools of thought. In other words, the community is made up of parts, and each part is necessary, not one note extra. Each of us is that musical note. So in that context, when you talk about the freedom of Egypt, we talk about it in a global sense, is the context of governments and institutions and systems and so on. But in individual sense, the same idea that individuals, you are fundamentally a free person. And this line is exactly lifted straight from the Bible, straight from the story of Exodus in the Declaration of Independence when it says that all people are created, it says all men, but all people are created equal and due to and have an inalienable rights endowed to us by our Creator. And that includes the right of freedom and the right of happiness and the rest that's documented there. So it comes down to individual freedoms, not just collective ones. So the story of Passover is also about our own personal emancipation in the sense, are we a free people? So yes, on a government institutional level, we have freedom of religion. You can prosecute anyone if someone infringes on your individual rights, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter, however, that's on a governmental level. What about on an individual level? Are we really free? That's a far bigger question. Because you can say, well, today with all the technologies we have, with your mobile phone, you can access any information, anywhere, anytime. So it seems like the biggest, greatest freedom. There's almost no limitations. But at the same time, look how many of us are addicted to our so-called gadgets and addicted to this, to the inundation of our senses and our overstimulation on every possible level. So though we do live in free times, we sometimes can wonder whether we're really free. Are you enslaved to other people's demands and expectations, to social pressure, peer pressure? So all these are themes that Passover addresses, which is how you find real freedom, which means your inner voice that is not the answering to anyone but to your higher destiny and your calling. So in that context, I wanted to talk about, I've discussed this every year, we talk about different themes related to this idea. So I decided to talk about 3 vital lessons for today that we can derive from Passover. So if you'll be sitting at a Seder table Passover night, which was a week from Friday night, and then again Saturday night, 2 Seders. So there are many aspects to the Seder. It's a 15-step process. I actually wrote up, if any of you are interested, you can look online at meaningfullife.com, our website. I wrote like 15 steps to personal freedom. How the Seder is actually a blueprint, like a mosaic, that is like a guide that helps a person achieve freedom. And hopefully next week, I'll give the class before Passover. I hope we have some extra ones in my office. A type of Haggadah, which is the Passover book that we read at the Seder table, a type of supplement, like an insert you can add the Haggadah, like the 15 steps, which is the construct of the Passover Seder, which you see are all 15 detailed steps in how one can reach a freer place in their lives, psychologically and emotionally and personally. And in addition, I've done other type of workshops around Passover, all with a similar theme, but actually really hands-on exercises and meditations and actions that we can do to improve our lives, basically. So I wanted to talk about something I don't think I've addressed before, but it's one piece in the Haggadah, in the Seder, that talks about the 3 main pillars of what Passover is about. So everyone knows, for example, Passover is probably most known for another name that it's called besides Passover, the holiday of the festival of matzot. We eat matzah. What is matzah? Matzah is a Hebrew name for unleavened bread. Basically, when you make bread, you take flour, water, yeast, allow fluffy challah, everyone's familiar with. On Passover, that's not permitted. On Passover, what you do is the matzah means something that was not allowed to rise. You take water and flour that's protected and watched over, and just the bare minimum. Put it into an oven so it looks like a thin cracker. and only 18 minutes from the time it was, from the time it's conceived until you actually bake it. It's a whole process of how matzahs are made. And we know them as most people know square matzahs, there's round matzahs. I'm not going to get into all the different variations, but the bottom line is it's considered to be the central food of Passover. And we make a special blessing on it. And when you look in the Bible, it says because when the Jews left Egypt, they were running quickly to escape the Egyptians. So they didn't have time to even wait for the matzah to rise, for the bread to rise. So matzah became a symbol of Passover. But it still remains for many cryptic. What exactly is this matzah about? And why is it not permitted to eat what we call chametz, which is leavened bread, irregular bread that, whether it's any type of bread, including challah and so on and so forth. So matzah is a central component. But there's also two other things that when we read at the end of the Haggadah, and we also ask them in the 4 questions that the children ask during the evening, why do we eat matzah? That's one of the questions. And why is this night Manishtana, the famous Manishtana, why is this night different than all other nights? And there are 4 questions that we ask. But the questions I'm focusing on now are the matzah, and there's another one is Pesach. Pesach matzah morah. Pesach is the paschal lamb that was offered during the temple times. Today we have a shank bone that is a symbol of it, and we talk about it, but we don't have the actual lamb, obviously. And there's morah, the third thing, which is morah, which is why we eat the bitter herbs. Now the technical reason is because to remind us of the bitter bondage and the pain that our ancestors went through. But if you really think about it, that's like a strange thing. You know, it's one thing, they suffered then. Why do we still have to remember suffering 300 years later? And do we really remember just by eating a few bitter herbs that make it a little like horseradish in your, does that really re-experience the pain that they had? Come on, if you really want to re-experience it, there are ways to do it. This is not it. So what exactly is the symbolism of the Marah on a very basic level? So I want to talk about these 3 things because, as I said, the Haggadah is made up of 15 steps, which I'm not going to go through now, but at the end of the main step, which is step 5, Magid, where you tell the story, the end there it goes 3 sections: Pesach, Al Shuman, the Matzah, and Marah. 3 steps, the 3 pillars. The Pesach, which is the Passover, the name of Passover. The second is the Matzah, and the third is the Marah. Now, you look at it ostensibly, it seems like archaic traditions that we may have some symbolic relevance, but it doesn't have any personal relevance. We may do it, and that's why for many people, the Seder is maybe a nostalgic, nice thing to do. You get together with the family. For some people, it's just a joke, even if they do it. For some people, it's just a burden. But as I've discussed many times, and as I said, a lot of this is online, both classes, video, as well as written articles. The truth is, when you dig deeper, you realize, especially when you know the spiritual and mystical significance, that these whole Seder carries tremendous and profound emotional and psychological lessons of how one achieves freedom. And when you really know how to decipher this, the code, so to speak, you suddenly realize that the Seder is an unbelievable gift to us that gives you what everybody's looking for. What are the steps to become a healthier, a freer, a more emancipated human being? Because all of us, even though we may not have the bondage as the Jews had during the time they were in the Egyptian slavery, but all of us are some ways enslaved. We can be enslaved to our jobs, to the people who pay our salaries, people we are dependent on, for good or for bad. We can be enslaved to our own psychological fears, inhibitions, insecurities. I mean, the times when the Jews left Egypt, they had no therapy then. Today, therapy is a major industry. Some say $1 trillion industry, but no one will ever know because many people deny that they go to therapy. Even though it's become somewhat fashionable, you know, like your therapist, my therapist, we compare therapists, but still we don't know the extent of how many hours we go to deal with our demons and our fears, whether they're real or imagined. But the one thing we do know is that almost anybody you know goes to therapy. So the question is, why did the Jews not go to therapy after the 210 years in bondage? What did they know, and how did they come out of it in a healthier way that today, in our modern age, we simply don't know those secrets? So looking in the Seder, looking at the Haggadah, the Passover, can teach us many things that may actually help you save money, because you may not have to go to that much therapy after this. So think of it that way. It's a free program, a Seder program. The problem is that most of us don't know how to interpret it or to decipher it. So that's what I suggested, to look at the several books I've done on this, several articles actually, and workshops. But I'm going to address another component of it. We only have that much time. A component, these 3 steps that I'm discussing now, which, as I said, initially can seem Passover, matzah, maror. I have no idea what these things are. Most people would say, I can't understand any relevance of it. I could see it as being, yes, some commemorative symbolism that it may carry. That's the most that many people will say. And even that, but as you shall see, and I hope I can do justice to it, these are actually 3 indispensable elements in life that can help us deal with the modern challenges of the year 2016, not 3,000 years ago, today, 2016, whether we're in New York, or in Jerusalem, or in London, or in Melbourne, or in Moscow, or in Sao Paulo, wherever we may be, and it deals with real relevant issues. We all have our twists and turns in life. There's no one that does not deal with certain struggles. Many of us, the most common struggle perhaps of all is relationships, financial challenges, personal challenges. You can fill in the blanks. So whatever it is that you're struggling with, whatever it is that you're dealing with, think of the holiday of Passover as an antidote, as a type of approach to deal with your challenges. And the key is to personalize it. It's not just some general idea, it's personalizing it. If you fill in that blank, here are my, make a list before Passover, or even now, a few weeks before, make a list of, here are the 3 to 5 items that I'd like to, obstacles that don't let me get where I want to be. They could be things you're aware of, things you're not aware of, and everybody can make a list like that. The more detailed, the better. And then test the waters. Try it going to a Seder, or especially a Seder that has that personal relevance, and try to use the Seder, not all of it, but at least components of it, to address those issues that you're struggling with. And I'm sure everybody has them. And I'm sure you know them better than anybody, because that's what's in your heart and mind all the time. So what are these 3 things of Passover, matzah, and maror? So I'll translate into simple English. The word Passover in Hebrew is Pesach. It comes from the verses in in Exodus, in the Bible, in the story of Exodus, that refers to God passing over the Jewish homes when he was striking the firstborn. Basically, Passover, in simple English, means transcendence, to transcend, to rise above, which is really the essence of all freedom, is the ability to transcend limitations, inhibitions, blockages, any form of constraint. It gets even more interesting when you know the Hebrew for the word Mitzrayim. Egypt in Hebrew is Mitzrayim. What does Mitzrayim mean? You know what it means? Constraints, boundaries, meitzar, limitations. Anything that is, we say, the dire straits, anything that limits, inhibits you, as I said before, both personally and collectively, is a form of Mitzrayim. And Pesach, Passover, is the ability to transcend those limitations. Well, I'll elaborate more soon. Matzah, I shall explain. Matzah is unleavened bread, is true, but its meaning, as explained by the mystics and by the Hasidic masters, is the concept of emptying yourself. It's called the word bittul. Sometimes translated as a combination of humility, modesty, the ability to suspend yourself in the face of something greater than yourself. The antithesis, of course, is arrogance, ego, self, the self. That's number 2. And number 3, maror, is really the concept of empathy. We eat bitter herbs not because we're recreating the pain. Obviously, it doesn't compare the pain. We're eating bitter herbs to have the concept of empathy, to feel someone else's pain. So we're doing something to remember and try to relate to, on some level, some sensitivity. When you see someone else suffer, many of us just turn the other way, and we're not interested. It's not my problem. Maror is identifying empathy, and that's why maror, if you look at the Seder plate, it's placed in the center, which is an obvious question that Rabbi Shneur Zalman asked the question, if maror is bitter, it belongs gevura, is always the left side. Why is it in the center? So he says, because it's not about gevura, it's not about severity, it's about empathy, rachmanos. So it's like when you see someone cry and you cry with them. That's maror. The ability to identify with another person, to empathize. And these are 3 tools, when you develop them properly, can change your entire life. Because what is really the issue when we're dealing with any type of so-called psychological form of slavery? I'm not talking here now about physical slavery where there's a people like the Egyptians that oppressed and enslaved another people. Thank God we don't have to deal with that today. But today the slavery is far more internal. What exactly is really the bottom line of being trapped? Being trapped is part of it is that we can be our own worst enemy, and we are trapped also by our own image of ourselves and our self-consciousness. If you were able to dissect a problem, let's say, how much of the problem is independent and objective problem, how much of it is our perception of the problem? Or I would better put, our experience of the problem. Because you see, for example, 2 people have gone through a difficult situation, and one is able to, is versatile enough to travel through it and not be hurt, and the other person becomes obsessed by it. Look at Holocaust survivors. You'll see some that have become so bitter and broken, they can't live. They couldn't live afterwards. And there are others that in some way were able to move on. Now, what move on doesn't mean they forgot, it doesn't mean they don't suffer, it doesn't mean they didn't deal with all the pain. But why is it 2 people in the same circumstances, growing up, let's say, in an abusive environment, or have other challenges, financial, personal, or other types of challenges, why does one person come out of it one way, another person is broken by it and becomes angry, bitter, and fearful? This is, of course, $1 million question, because if we could find this formula and answer, we'd be able to then replicate it. But it comes down to usually one major factor: how you look at yourself. If a person, for example, I'm just using a simple, very generic way of putting it. If a person loathes themselves, is very self-conscious, very insecure, very fearful. I know I'm speaking in extremes, but I want to give I want to paint it in an extreme way so it's easier to relate to. And that person is living a fine life, everything is going well, but they're fundamentally a fearful, insecure, self-conscious, always looking over their shoulder, second-guessing themselves, maybe due to growing up in a home where they were always criticized and never their self-worth and self-confidence was never nurtured and properly reinforced. Let's take that scenario. Now this person then suddenly hits a wall or something happens to their life. What do you expect will be the results? Since they're entering already with fear and insecurity and self-consciousness, you can imagine that when something negative happens, it'll devastate them. Because their own consciousness and their own unconsciousness, it just verifies and confirms everything they always knew, that I'm worthless, that I'm not worthy, I'm not valuable enough, and that's why these things are happening to me. That's one attitude. Then let's take the other extreme. A person who grew up in a home that was nurtured, they're very confident, have high self-esteem. I'm not talking about arrogance now, I'm talking about a healthy sense of self. They're secure, make decisions, and are not fearful. Again, it's an extreme. What happens when something negative happens in that person's life? So you can predict exactly what will happen. It may still hurt them, and they'll still maybe not troubled by it, but they will definitely ride it through differently than the first type of person. So you see right there, it's nothing to do with what happened to you. It has to do with who you are and what kind of tools you have before it happened to you. Now, we should all be protected, and God should protect us all. We should never have any challenges. But think of it like 2 swimmers, a good swimmer, an excellent swimmer, and a swimmer that's not an excellent swimmer. Where can you tell the difference between the two? So when the waters are just regular, calm, peaceful waters, you maybe can't tell the difference between a good swimmer and a bad swimmer. But you know when a storm strikes? When the storm strikes, then you suddenly see. A bad swimmer will fight the storm, will try to swim against the tide. A good swimmer knows how to navigate. What they'll do is they will relax them. They know you have to choose your battles. They won't fight the tide because it'll destroy you. It'll exhaust you. So good swimmers don't mean that they can deal with every situation. They just know when to, as they say, when to hold them and when to fold them, when to surge forward and when to relax. And when there's a down period, when things are not going so well, it's like a good investor knows, or a good business person, now's the time to build, maybe maintain my business. Maybe I shouldn't try to fight the storm. That's the difference between a wise and experienced swimmer and someone who's not experienced. The non-experienced swimmer simply doesn't know. So they think, you know what, I may be strong enough, I'm overconfident. So you see the same storms strike people, and there's the difference between the strong tree and the weak tree, which you cannot tell in peaceful moments when it's calm. You can tell when there's a storm. Suddenly you realize the tree that stands is because its roots are solid. And we don't build strength during a storm. We build strength before the storm. So when the storm strikes, you have the tools and the resources. So what the Judaism teaches us is how to build these resources. So when things happen, you're already armed. You're already preempted. Somewhat of a preventive type of medicine. Now, this doesn't mean it's guaranteed. It doesn't mean that it's going to help in every detail, but it will allow you to maintain your equilibrium. Because once you lose your equilibrium in difficult times, obviously then you lose your most important resource. When you're fighting a battle and you lose confidence, or you lose the ability to really feel direction and guidance, what happens? That itself becomes part of the problem. That's why in warfare, psychological warfare is just as important as physical warfare. You've had armies in history that were far weaker and far lesser in number, and weaker and less artillery and less what's the word I want to use? Brute power, brute force, but psychologically they had an advantage over the enemy, and that's how they won. Psychological warfare is a tremendous thing. Sun Tzu, in his classic book, The Art of War, writes that battles are won before the battle begins. Those that know how to win a battle win before they begin. Then they go and fight the war and they just clean up. It means it's in the head. It's the attitude knowing you're capable. You're capable. A capable person who's gone through battles and has that confidence fights very differently than someone who's never fought, even if that latter has more resources. So our attitudes and who we are is equally, if not more important than what happens to us. And that's the first thing that you have to realize. Never to personalize an experience. What does that mean? It means you may suffer, but doesn't mean you're a sufferer. You may have been hurt, doesn't mean that you deserve to be hurt. In other words, not to be the victim. Things happen to people. That's very different than you becoming identified with the thing that happened to you. That's very different. Now, obviously, the best way to approach this is, as I said, preemptive. By entering the fray in a way that you already have that strength, so when something happens, you know how to deal with it. Viktor Frankl built an entire psychological system called logotherapy, man in search of meaning, based on his observations in the concentration camps of Jews that had a sense of faith and religion and meaning. That's why he called man in search of meaning. And those that did not. They both suffered equally. Both suffered horribly. The dehumanization, the sadism, the murders of innocent people, everyone suffered equally. But he said that he was able to observe a difference between a person who had meaning in life in some way, not that the suffering became less, in some way they had more strength to ride through the storm. And were able to come out with it somewhat with some power, because they had some type of connection to something greater than themselves. When you rely completely on yourself and then the storm strikes, you have nothing to turn to. He doesn't use this expression, but in the Hasidic terminology, it's an expression when you're tied above, you don't fall below. If ever one needs God and faith, it's in times of challenges. Because at the end of the day, we're all humans and we're mortals, and we cannot manage everything on our own. When we have a connection to something that's greater than yourself, that allows you to transcend your experience. Allows you to not be defined and identified by that personal experience. So you see people, I remember dealing with this a number of times, many times, two people fired from their job, and one person literally cannot come to themselves. And another person, they don't like what happened, they pick up the pieces and figure it out. And when you study the people, you'll see exactly what I just pointed out. It's not, they're both fired with the same type of job, same day, from the same company. Why? What makes them different? And it's not just some mystery. It has a lot to do with how they see themselves before they were fired. If their job defined them, and whatever they do defines them, then of course when you're fired, that defines you too. But if their job didn't define them, they had an identity independent of their job, then the job is just a job. It's important to have a job. You want to have a living. You want to make a living. You want the security. But the job is not your entire life. It's like a diversification type of thing where you know there's more eggs than one basket. You have options. And there's a lot to do with what kind of resilience and what kind of inner sense of self you have that defines. And I've given a talk I've given a number of times. It's called, "Is your self-worth defined by your net worth?" For most people, it is. You ask people, "What do you do?" And you ask people, "Who are you?" They give you their business card. But who you are is not what you do. Who you are is who you are, and what you do is what you do. But we over-identify with our identities with what we do, because that's what we do all day. At some point, that becomes your personality. But it's not your personality. So the first lesson of Passover in this concept is transcendence. The element of Passover, to pass over the immediate situation. You are not a product or a sum total of your parts. You are not a product of your circumstances. You have an independent self that when you were born and entered this world, using the biblical term, created in the divine image, you're a soul, a special, indispensable soul, and hopefully, if your parents were healthy, they nurtured that, they validated, they reinforced it time and again in your childhood, and therefore growing into adult, you know that you are a self, you are an individual that is worthy. This does not mean arrogance, it does not mean necessarily a sense of haughtiness and pompous. It means just a sense of value, that I have inherent value. And then there are the things I do in my life. I have a good job, I have things that work, some things don't work, but they never shake up your core self. That, of course, is the healthiest scenario. Obviously, I'm quite aware that most of us don't have that, so I'll address that soon. But we have to talk about, if you talk about things that are aberrations, first you have to talk about what the healthy version is. To begin our discussion by talking about unhealthy situations, we'll never know what health is. As you know, when they take an x-ray of your lungs, afterwards you compare it to healthy lungs, and here's the lung, God forbid, that are, let's say, have some infection, and you can compare it, you juxtapose it, so you can see what the context is. The same thing is in this context. We have to know what the ultimate healthy human being is, the quintessential healthy psyche, in order to discuss about distorted psyches. So none of us are the perfect quintessential healthy person. That's not possible in this world. But it doesn't mean we can't study and understand what health is. The health is a person completes, their self is generated from within and not stimulated from without. In other words, it has nothing to do with what other people think about you. You're not here to please anybody. You're not here to satisfy other people's needs and expectations. Your choices in life are generated from within your soul and spirit based on who you are, not based on what you do and not based on what others want you to do, including parents and educators and society. That's the perfect type of healthy self. A person like that is by fundamental a transcendent person, because there's nothing in the world that can shake them, because they have a sense of self. It's to think of it like a ship with a very steady rudder and steady direction. There may be challenges, there may be storms, as I mentioned, but this good swimmer knows how to swim because they have a navigation coming from within them. They know how to navigate. That's an internal mechanism. And we all are entitled and have that working. As I said, I'll soon discuss what happens if you don't have that fully functioning. But that's the healthy version, and that's a transcendent human being. Simply means you're not defined by your circumstances. No matter what happens, that does not define you, for good or for bad. People who over-identify with great things in their lives will also over-identify with bad things in their lives. So you're not a product or defined by your experiences. The truth is, your experience should be defined by who you are, not you should be defined by your experiences. Okay, but what happens if a situation, so that's transcendence, that's Pesach, Passover. What happens in a situation where we don't have that, or we don't think we have it? We were born, let's say, in homes that did not validate that sense of self, or other things in life that happened that somewhat undermined our own inner dignity. So the first thing you need to know, and this is Passover's lesson as well, that just because you think you don't have it doesn't mean you don't have it. It just means you're not aware that you have it. It's true, it's far easier if our parents and our educators and our environments reinforced and validated that sense of self. That definitely gives you a far more fighting chance. But don't ever think that your soul does not exist. Your soul is always there, and it has that self-confidence. The problem is there's a cutoff between you and your soul, which means your inner confidence that you deserve and have, you're simply not aware of. The question then is, what do you do? So that's where we have the other two steps. Number one is, step number two rather, is the concept of matzah. So 7-8 days a year, which is Passover, we're told to actually eat a different type of bread. Right? Sometimes it's called the bread of the afflicted. But the truth is, as I said, sometimes it's called bread of humility. Humility, everyone thinks of it being a nice, virtuous thing to have humility. Humility happens to be a force in our lives that can actually save our lives. Because you see, when you have a negative self-image, part of the problem is there's a certain arrogance to that too. I know it sounds strange, but counterintuitively, you're convinced that you're worthless. You're convinced that you don't have value. So the question is, how do you know that for sure? Isn't that an arrogant statement to say that you're for sure worthless, or you surely know that you're not valuable unless you do A, B, C, D? So arrogance can take on two shapes. It can take on the shape of an arrogant person walking around saying, I'm the best, I'm God's gift to the earth and better than everybody. It could also be a person who says, I'm worse than everybody and nobody can change my mind because I'm sure of it. But who gave you the right to be so sure of it? So the second step, I should say, matzah, is emptying yourself. Emptying yourself is an exercise of shedding the perceptions you have of things. I'll give you this classic story. I often humorous anecdote for this. Chełm was a town in Poland that had, they said, very wise people, but the neighbors were resentful, so they created this folklore of the fools of Chełm. So there's the story told about the Chełm farmer. He had a farm, and Chełm, you can imagine, was a small town, so the farm was tiny, but it was his farm. He inherited from his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. So it was like his baby. He knew every grain of soil. He cared for the farm. One day he gets a visitor, a cousin, a distant cousin from the United States of America, who owns a farm of thousands of acres. Where are the 1,000-acre farms? In Kansas, Texas, wherever. And his cousin, the Chełm farmer, gives him a tour of his little farm. They sit down to dinner, and he says to his cousin, the big farmer, the big city farmer, he says, so what do you think about my farm here? He says, it's so nice and cute, but it's tiny. Now the Chełm farmer is taken aback. This is like his personal baby, and he's like insulting a tiny farm. He says, how big is your farm? He says, with a defiant tone, how big is your farm in Texas? So how is a American farmer going to explain to a little Polish shtetl farmer what his farm is like? So he looks for a point of reference and he says to him, well, my farm, I'll tell you how large it is. It takes me all day to travel from one end with my tractor from one end of the farm to the other, all day. So the Chełm farmer suddenly, his face turns compassionate, and he says, don't feel bad, cousin. I once had a tractor like that too. Okay? So now, if we were to pass out a questionnaire and someone were to ask you, do you think you're closed-minded, narrow-minded, subjective? Most people would not mark those boxes. Now, because part of being subjective is it makes you think you're objective. Now, this Chełm farmer was not malicious. He simply couldn't fathom that size farm. So he had no context, no perspective at all. So what did he say? So he said, it takes you all day. It reminded him of his old shmata jalopy that took him all day to crank up, to travel from here to here. We all have our farms, every one of us. Think of it like the horizon. Someone says to you, what does the horizon look like? So if you're standing on the street on Broadway or Fifth Avenue, and someone says to you, what does the horizon look like? You tell me what it's going to look like. You barely see it. There's buildings, and maybe sometime you see a little sky and a sun. Now, you climb up on top of a mountain. Let's say halfway up, the horizon looks different. You climb to the top of the mountain, it's a whole different answer. Now, the same person will give you 3 different answers based on where they're standing. It all depends on our perspective. So really, the answer is, how objective are you? The answer should be, I'm as objective as my perspectives allow me to be. Because it's not always about maliciousness. It's not because it's simply not you don't have the experience. How would we know what a horizon is like unless you climb to the top of a mountain? If you lived your entire life in a valley, that's all you know. That's all you see. This Chełm farmer had his farm. Every one of us has our farm. And there's nothing to be embarrassed, nothing shameful about knowing that your farm is a limited farm. Actually, it's shameful if you try to convince yourself that it's not. So the first step from subjectivity to objectivity is awareness of your limits, or at least making the statement, I don't know more than what I know. To make a statement that I know it, I'm convinced, that is usually the statement of an insecure, arrogant person who's just wants to convince themselves that they figured it out. That doesn't help anyone, it doesn't help you. So the second step, transcendence, how to get to transcendence when you're not there, is you have to empty yourself of previous notions, previous stereotypes, preconceptions. Now this doesn't mean you have to erase everything on your hard drive, on your mind, but it means you have to be open to hearing something new. I find this all the time. The biggest challenge is not sharing new information. It's getting people to be receptive to hear something they haven't heard before. Most people fit ideas into previous frameworks. That's how we do things. Stereotype doesn't always mean bad. It means you're fitting it into your structure, into your comfort zone, to your shelves. You file it the way you want to fit it in. The ability to free yourself, to open yourself up, to empty yourself is, I think, even a better way to put it, is the key to all growth and knowledge. I've discussed this many times about taking myself as a personal example, the kosher guinea pig, and that is the years that I worked on remembering the Rebbe, my teacher's talks. So on Shabbat and holidays, no tapes and recordings were made, no notes were taken. So how do you remember 6-7 hours of dense, complicated discussions? The first step is you have to empty your mind, which is counterintuitive. Most people think that memory would require the concentration of using your mind. Absolutely not. It's the opposite. Because the mind has two parts to it. It's a part that absorbs information, and there's the part that processes information. Adults are processing information all the time. You could see it. You could see it in their eyes. You could see it immediately. Absorbing and listening is a far harder thing to do. Most people do not listen well. Not because they're bad people. They're not trained to listen. We train to process. Little children listen because they have nothing to process. They don't have frameworks yet. They don't have preconceived notions. They're a clean slate. Think of a dry sponge. It absorbs everything. What about a saturated sponge, a wet sponge? Tell me how much it's going to absorb. Our adult minds are like wet sponges, with good ideas and some bad ideas too. But even your good ideas are also part of the wetness. It means you already have an idea. So now you hear a new idea. What do you think you're going to do? You're going to fit it into your old idea with a little modification, and here's a detail, another detail. I'll fill it in. That's why you'll see very often, I'm sure this happens to me many times. You share an idea, then you hear some new details about the idea, and you register that. But then, a year later, when you repeat the idea, you usually will repeat it without the new details. Because what's registered in your psyche, in your mind, is the idea the way you first heard it. And then someone says, 1 second, there's a few more details. You say, right. But they never became part of your framework because you really never absorbed them. You processed them. Well, it's a longer discussion and not so relevant to everything I'm saying, but it's an example. Emptying yourself is one of the healthiest things a person can do. It's literally like you talk about it from a dietetic point of view. It's like the cleanser. It's like cleansing your system in order to refresh. It's like rebooting. Now, obviously, we can't empty our entire beings because we are made up of memories and we have plenty of experiences. We're not trying to erase all the good things in our past, but we're trying to not be trapped by them. We're trying to experience a lech-lecha, a type of transcendence again, but through emptying yourself. So matzah that's what matzah says. There's nothing wrong with eating bread. According to Torah, we eat bread all year round. As a matter of fact, it was brought as an offering every day in the temple, lechem apanim and so on. It was a part of the service. And we eat Shabbos, Chalas, and so on. But once a year, God says, the Torah says, free yourself. Change your pattern. Manishtana, tonight is different than all other nights. We're going to do something different. We're going to empty ourselves. Instead of eating this inflated piece of bread, we're going to eat very leavened, very thin crust. And children will ask the question, why do we do that? And the answer is because we need to experiencing something new. We need to empty ourselves of the air, which inflates the yeast that makes fluffy bread. So that's right there an opportunity to empty ourselves in order to allow. And that everybody can do. What I said earlier is not everybody was blessed with having a healthy home, healthy environments that help nurture your sense of self and self-confidence. But even if you didn't have that, you have the opportunity to empty yourself. Who says you have to be a product of your past? And the first step is basically saying, I may not have it all figured out. There's really nothing wrong with that. The first step to growth is realizing that our preconceived notions or our past experiences don't have to define your future. Now, if everything is going well, you could argue, okay, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Continue doing it. Even then, I would argue it's always good to grow and get beyond your natural patterns. But if things are not going that well, so what is insanity, they say? Someone's doing the same thing and expecting different results. Or they say in healing, nothing changes, nothing changes. Or I like the expression, actually, I don't know if I coined it or I don't know, at this point I don't remember where it came from. But if you think what you thought, you say what you said, and you do what you did, what are you going to have? You don't need to be a mathematician to know. You're going to have what you had. If you think what you thought, you say what you said, you do what you did, you're going to have what you had. That's how it works. I know it doesn't sound it's not very brilliant, but that's basically the equation. If you don't do anything different, why do you expect a different result? You're going to walk this way, you're going to strike a billiard ball always this way at the exact same angle, it's always going to have the same result. It's normal. We, in our own insanity, human beings think we could do the same thing and maybe something will be different this time. Why? I'm not sure, but that's how we think. But that's what Pesach is about. It is exactly manishtan. It's a part of changing and specifically emptying ourselves, which is essentially the bread of humility. It's the humility. So humility becomes more than just a nice virtue that I'm humble, not arrogant, that I'm kind, I'm sensitive. But humility is actually a tool to empty yourself of your own past, not to be defined by it, not to be trapped by it. And that opens up the possibility of a new solution. So you're not just doing the same old thing again. You're not just replaying the broken record, the rut that we get into. And then the third thing, which is another tool used to get beyond yourself, to transcend, is empathy. The ability to empathize with another person is, again, many people think that's a nice thing to do. Someone's in pain, or someone is suffering, or someone is in any given predicament. Empathize, we feel it's almost our obligation. I'm talking about those that feel that. But it's much deeper than that. Empathy actually does more for you than necessary for the other person. It turns you into a person that's not self-consumed and not self-absorbed. It's another way of emptying ourselves, but this is through empathy. It's caring about another person. What does that mean? It entails not being so selfish. Not just seeing yourself, but seeing another. They say there was this miser who was once a brilliant student and a very fine man, but then he became, God blessed him with wealth. And for some people, wealth makes them better people, and for many people, it makes them worse people. Well, in this case, it was the latter. He became very selfish. And he had this fetish called a mirror fetish. He loved to buy mirrors of all shapes and forms and sizes, and a house filled with mirrors. But no one else ever entered this home because he was a miser. But once his great teacher came by the city, and of course he had him as a guest because he was honored to have this teacher. The teacher gave one look and saw what this happened to his prize student. And so he's looking around at all the mirrors, and he says to the man, tell me, what is the difference between a mirror and a pane of glass? They're both made out of glass. So the miser tells the teacher, it's obvious. A mirror is a pane of glass with silver smeared on the back. And the rabbi said, his teacher said to him, and what happens when you smear the silver on the back? What changes? He says, well, pane of glass, you look out the window, you see others. In a mirror, you see yourself. I think at that point, the student who was once a student got the message. There's something about materialism and money and other so-called things that make you feel maybe better about yourself, but you begin to only see yourself. It becomes a mirror. You see yourself. This form, that form, and that form. And a window that does not have that glass is transparent. You see others. You're busy looking at yourself all day. Obviously, you're not interested in what others have to feeling or experiencing. Empathy. When we eat maror, we empathize. You say, you're tasting something that is not so pleasant to the mouth, not so pleasant to the tongue, but you're empathizing and remembering that there were people who suffered back then and people who suffered today. We break a glass under the chuppah, a wedding ceremony, to remember that even in our high point of joy, there are some people who may be broken. We don't get overconsumed with our own experiences. And empathy has tremendous healing abilities. So even if you want to do empathy out of selfishness, begin Shalei Lishma, you could do it that way. Because it allows you to get beyond yourself and seeing another. There's an additional element to that, and that is, there's an expression in the Talmud that when you pray for someone else in need, a similar need that you have, God will answer you first and give you your need. An interesting expression. In other words, let's say, God forbid, somebody is ill, and they pray for someone else that has the same illness. It says you will be answered first, because you prayed for someone else. A person has a different challenge, and they help somebody else in that situation, you will get blessed first. Why? Because it shows that you have gone beyond. You're not self-consumed. You're able to think about another, so God then thinks about you. You think about yourself. Why should God think about you if you're thinking about yourself? So what's one of the explanations? So basically, by demonstrating a certain ability to transcend yourself and reach to another and care for another, then you are cared for. That's how it works. It's a type of reciprocal system, that those that have empathy to others, empathy will be shown to you. It's a midah keneged midah, tit for tat in a way. Not as a punishment, not as a reward. It's just the nature of the beast. I don't know if beast is the right word. The nature of the experience. It says, kamayim aponim leponim, kein leva adam la'adam. Like a face is reflected in water, so one heart is reflected in another. Now, many of us want people to love us. They want us to have. Why doesn't God have empathy of Rachmanis on me? When's the last time you've shown Rachmanis on someone else? It's a mirror image. If you're unable to get out of your own way and care for another, and only look at a mirror and see yourself, why should anyone be seeing you through a glass? You've chosen the mirror. So that's what you'll see. You'll see yourself and you'll be stuck with yourself. So empathy is the ability to transcend and get beyond ourselves, to look through a glass instead of a mirror. And silver is the difference. Money, silver, materialism, spread on a plain piece of glass turns it from transparent into self-absorbed. That's the rule of the game. Materialism plus anything healthy will turn something into selfishness. That's the nature of materialism. It's a consumer. Richard Dawkins said it well, the selfish gene. It's absolutely right, as long as you're a gene. But if you also have a soul, and you have the capacity to transcend yourself and care for another, then you opened up the door to be cared for as well. In this world, many people think, I want to be loved, but I don't have to give love back. That's the distortion that many people have. Everyone else should be vulnerable except me. And people are trying to devise all kinds of gimmicks. How can I keep taking without giving? Or give the least and get the most? This is one of the methods that the human beings try to employ. So I understand in business, obviously you want to pay the least and get the most. But in relationships, it sounds a little obscene, no? That you say, I want to give the least and get the most. It sounds very selfish, very self-oriented. But remember, everything comes around. If you put up a wall and you want no one to enter, you also, if you put up a wall and you don't want to exit that wall, no one can enter either. You think someone can enter your heart if you're not ready to open your heart to them? That's an unhealthy relationship. Kamayim aponim leponim. The face reflected in water is natural. You can't do anything about it. You look at water, it's going to reflect your face. When you look at a heart, it reflects in a heart. Words from the heart enter the heart. And if you haven't reached somebody, it means you probably haven't spoken from the heart. I know it's easy to always blame the other, and they say that they're blocked, and they're like a wall, and they're whatever it is, verstoppt. But it's how it works. It's a symbiotic. It's not the word I wanted to use. This symbiotic type of experience. So the 3 points, Pesach, Matzah, Maror, are transcendence, the ability to transcend yourself, which is the essence of it all. That you're not defined by your experiences. You may have suffered, but it doesn't make you a sufferer. You may have lost something, it doesn't make you a loser. You may have experienced a setback, it doesn't make you a setback a person. It means things have happened to you. And you'll see time and again that people who are resilient, are able to get through situations are always able to distinguish between them and the experience. Anyone who over-identifies experience with a person, right away know there's psychological difficulties involved, because now you don't, how do you separate? So then all your negative experiences become a testimony to who you are, and that's not the case. If any people ever demonstrated that, it was the Jewish people. We were defined by what happened in Egypt, and then what happened to us throughout the centuries, we would be complete, we wouldn't even exist today. I know I want to say, most people say Jews are neurotic, but they've also survived. It means because we did not over-identify with these experiences. We were able to transcend them. Always knew that there's a bigger picture, there's a bigger story, and the story's not over just because right now it's painful or difficult. You're able to have that type of transcendence. That's Pesach. And then there's Matzah, is a situation where let's say you have not able to transcend. So Matzah is a tool. What is the tool? The tool of emptying yourself. Emptying yourself. The food of humility, the food of humility. Emptying your preconceived notions, the stereotype that I elaborated on before. And Morah, Pesach Matzah Morah is empathy. That's why the Morah is in the middle of the kaira, the middle of the Seder plate, because seemingly it's gevura, it's severity. It should have been on the left side of the plate. So the Alter Rebbe in the Torah explains it's in the middle because it's about compassion. Why do we eat maror? As I mentioned before, to experience the pain of our ancestors. First of all, how could you compare the taste of maror to that pain? It's like not even comparable. And second of all, what's the point? Just why do we need to recreate pain? Because the whole point of maror is not pain, it's about compassion. It's to feel the pain of someone else. So it's to remind us that it's not about me. You do something that's not about you. It's about feeling and sensing another. So that comes down to, so you teach transcendence, emptying yourself, empathy. These are three major tools. You employ these tools in any challenge in life, guaranteed that you're able to deal with it. Now, implementing it is the challenge, but those are the tools. That's what we're told. And now, interestingly, Pesach, which is we don't bring a Paschal lamb today because we don't have the temple. So Pesach is the healthiest scenario. When the temple stood, it was considered a spiritual healthy time. That's why the divine presence was here on earth. In a spiritual healthy time, transcendence was a natural thing for people. Today, transcendence does not come easy. We over-identify with our experiences. That's why today we need more matzah maror in a physical sense than we do need Pesach. The concept of Pesach exists. The whole holiday is actually called that. And we have different things that commemorate the shank bone, the zreya, and other things that remember. But in actuality, what we do have today in actual is eating matzah and the maror. Those are the two. That's why in the four questions you don't have the question that was asked during the times of the temple. There was a fifth question asked about eating the Paschal lamb, tzli, broiled. So, because today we don't have that. So in the four questions we talk about matzah, maror. There's the other two questions which I didn't address. But the bottom line is that matzah, maror, because those are two tools that even in the unhealthy times, even when you did not grow up in a transcendent environment, in a home and a family that helped you develop a sense of self-confidence and self-esteem that can help you to transcend experiences around you. So we have the two tools, which is number one, as I said, emptying yourself, that everybody's capable of, and empathizing, also everyone's capable of. These are two things we all possible for us to do, and when you do that, the results are far beyond anything you invest. I mentioned the story, I think, a number of times. There was a fellow who came to this class for a good few years. He used to sit in the back. It was not here. The class was in a different location. And I saw he was an interesting guy. So he never communicated with me, which is fine. I respect people come. Everyone comes for their own reason. But one day he comes over to me after the class. He wants to speak for a few minutes. So we begin to speak. He tells me about his life. And due to his own confidentiality, I won't say his name. But he's a person whose father is well known. And very, very, very wealthy. The way he put it to me briefly was, he says, I live in a gilded cage. My cage is a very large cage. It's the whole world. I have private planes. I have anywhere I want to go for entertainment. We have an island. Women, whatever I want, I can have. Look, a 36-year-old guy. But it's a cage built by my father, who I have a good relationship with, but it's nothing of my doing. I just have everything I need, anything I want, I can dream of. And I feel emasculated. I feel like I will never have a life because I haven't earned anything. And I just don't feel anything that motivates me, nothing. I heard your classes online, then I started coming, and I really like what you say, but was there any hope for a person like me? I'm giving you the short version of it. So I said to him, are you capable of just rejecting all that wealth and just living your life on your own without getting anything from your father, from your family? He said, no, he does not have that strength. He's thought about it a number of times. He just does not have it. It's impossible. He's too spoiled. He's too accustomed to it. It's just not going to give it up. So I was looking at him with empathy, to be very honest, and I didn't have anything to say, because what do you do? I know all of us would love this blessing, right? Not have any worries at all, but also have nothing to live for. And he was distracting me, smart enough to know he was distracting himself and numbing himself and doing this and doing that. Anyway, as we're speaking, I came up with something. Something came to me. And it grew on me as we were speaking. So I said to him, I have a thought. Just food for thought. I want to make a suggestion. My suggestion is that you should volunteer at one of these homes for special children, like once a week, and go take a walk with a Down syndrome child or a child with other special needs. Just volunteer. His immediate reaction, I'll hire someone, I'll send them. I said, no, that's not the point. I know you could hire people. You should do it. That's the whole point, that you. Anyway, the more he resisted, the more I realized, this is it. So I said, okay, you're coming to me for advice. I'm giving you a piece of advice that you can't tell me you don't have time, because you have all the time in the world. You're capable of doing it. You just don't want to. So why are you asking me for advice? I don't understand. This is relatively easy. I'm not telling you to drop all the money. It's a simple thing. Once a week. I said, because it's not your comfort zone. I understand. That's why I'm suggesting it. Anyway, to his credit, he finally did it. A few months passed. He came back to me and he said to me, I wanted you to know, not only I do it once a week, I do it 3 times a week now. And it's unbelievable. He says, I walk with these children, I play with them, I take them to the park, whatever it is. And he says they have so much love in them. They don't know who I am. They don't care who I am. They don't care whether I have money or don't have money. There's just this completely natural and unconditional love that I'm getting a lot more than I think the children are. Anyway, he kept on doing this. After 6-7 months, he's told me, not long ago, that he's going to open up a special home like this, because now he sees things that are not being served, the certain needs that children have, and he's going to help fund it, and help also fund other homes like this. And he's found his calling. And he can't thank me enough for opening up the door. What did he do? It changed his life. And now he's dating someone. It looks like Siri's going to get married soon. His life changed. By doing what? Not by taking, by giving. By changing his, first of all, getting out of his comfort zone, by empathizing. He brought into his world something of fresh air. Instead of looking at the mirror that was paved with silver, he looked through a window. He empathized and cared for another person. So, firstly, it got him out of his patterns. Secondly, it got him to think about another. When you think about another, God thinks about you. And not just as a miracle, it means you open yourself up to fresh air. You're not just breathing the same recycled air, psychologically speaking. And his life will be changed. He will spend a lot of money doing this. He has the money, so that's not the problem. For him, the problem was having a life, not money. And it was just an example how the third point I made with empathy, but also the second point about emptying yourself. You have to get out of your comfort zone. You cannot keep on doing the same old thing if you want change. It just does not work. That's why, unfortunately, in most cases, it's pain or trauma or some loss that shakes people up. Why? Because that shakes them out of their comfort zone. What I'm saying is Pesach teaches us we don't need to wait for something like that to happen. God forbid. We can do it ourselves by shaking ourselves up, opening yourself up to something new, fresh, different. Nishtana, that's exactly what the word means. Nishtana, different. It's a change. Now, I know in most religious communities or people who do the Manashtan itself has become part of the mechanical thing. We say Manashtan, and we say L'shanis. It's the whole point of Manashtan is to change things that night. So children should ask, why are we doing differently? But then you grow up in homes and say, that itself becomes now a mechanical thing, that we're going to change something, but that misses the whole point. So we're changing things just to change things. To change things really means seriously to change. But that's part of the trap, that sometimes that itself becomes a ritual. Once it becomes a ritual, it loses its spontaneity. So maybe we have to introduce new changes. I don't mean new, God forbid, less changing Jewish law or halacha, but it means doing it more in the spirit and actually getting our children more excited, letting them get excited about us instead of us telling them, this is what we're going to do to change things. Maybe we get them involved with their imagination. And I can't resist always telling the story. Remember when I was a kid, sitting at the Seder table, I used to go to my grandparents, and I had a bunch of uncles, my mother's brothers, one more, let's put it this way, devout than the next, one more dogmatic than the next, maybe a better word to put it. And I remember sitting there, my uncles, and I was a little kid, enjoying myself. Seder's fun. They were not, for them it wasn't fun, it was very, very serious. Like, being careful, if I touched their plate, forget about it, it became like so of course I would make an effort to touch their plates. A little Jewish kid contaminating their. So I remember I was sitting there by the Seder, so there's the part where you drink the cups, and other parts where you lean. Mesubim, the fourth, we lean, we recline. And I know, I guess I drank a little wine and I reclined, and my uncle hits my head and says, you're not reclining enough. You got to recline more. And he keeps hitting me in my head. Recline, recline. I said, why do you have to recline? He says, freedom, it's about freedom. Bang, 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 freedom. You got to be free. Like he was about to, he says, if you're not going to be free, I'll kill you right now. That type of thing. So he's forcing me to be free. What do you think about that? That's interesting twist, right? So it's like we're changing things in order to provoke the children, but then that itself becomes. So that's what our job is to create a little excitement, and should actually be spirit differently. Seder tables that become mechanical, everything is, I don't understand how you could say Manashtanu when it's mechanical. I understand it's different than the rest of the year, but it's the same as last Passover. Isn't Manashtanu supposed to be different even from the last Passover, no? What do you think? How do they teach Manashtana? Compared to Erev, to the day before, right? Yeah, but think about it. What does it mean? Okay. So there's a halachic argument for it, but I think the spirit is not exactly like that. Yeah. What it means is that it's taka different. It's different than the rest of the year, meaning to say that it's something really different, not something that we just do once a year. Anyway, so I hope this did some justice to the. As I said, I've spoken about many aspects of the Seder in this context, but I think in the psychological terms, transcendence, emptying yourself, and empathy, which is an acronym T. I just realized transcend, T-E-E. It doesn't. I don't know if it makes sense here, but anyway, are three elements of the Seder which definitely go into the whole context of freedom, which include all the other parts, and I've discussed that, as I said, previous years. You can check that out. I'll conclude with one thing, which is always strikes me, which is, the Haggadah, which is the name of the actual book that we read. The Haggadah means to relate, to tell a story, Magid. And we say Magid is one of the 15 steps to tell the story, which is begins with the 4 questions that children ask. So a number of years ago, as we were asking the questions, I realized that I had a 5th question, not from the time of the temple, from now. And that is that when you go through the whole Haggadah, you finish the Seder, only 2 out of the 4 questions are actually answered. Why we eat matzah and why we eat bitter herbs are answered, but why we dip and why we recline is not answered. There's nowhere in the Haggadah that mentions it, not even alludes to it. Now, I don't know if you know how many Haggadahs there are out there, but like every Tom, Dick, and Harry has written Haggadah, except me. Almost everybody has written on Haggadah. And I can't find anyone answering this question. Why are the other 2 questions not answered? So I asked it at the table. So one smart Alex said, because the whole reason we ask the questions is to get the children to provoke them.
by the time the Haggadah is over, they're asleep anyway. So they'll never know that the questions were not answered. That's what he tells me. So I said, okay, but they're going to grow older one day, and then they're going to wonder, what was this, some type of scam? Sham, whatever. And then I came to this is my thought on the matter. And that is, the Haggadah, the word Ve'gadata levincha, to tell our children. Ki shalcha bincha, when a child will ask, Ve'gadata, you'll tell. And Magid, Sher Lemeshiv, question, answer, it's in that context. What is the greatest freedom? Passover's freedom. What's the greatest freedom of all? The right and the ability to ask questions. From our enemies make us wise. If you look at the enemies of freedom throughout history, fascists, totalitarians, one extreme, right or left, one thing is in common among all them all. They did not want people asking questions. That's why they controlled the media, the airwaves. Why? Because information cannot be free. Now, they all immediately establish, whenever you see them established, the first thing they establish is a ministry, a Bureau of Truth and Information. As soon as you know there's a Bureau of Truth and Information, you can rest assured it's neither true nor information. What's the word translate? What does pravda mean in Russian? True. Imagine a newspaper called The Truth. Would you trust it? And there was a Yiddish paper in Russian called Emes. It was the communist Yiddish paper called Emes. Also truth. But I guess the Jews were smart enough, they spelled it Ayin Mem, Ayin Samach. So anyone that knows Yiddish or Hebrew knows that's misspelling. So maybe it was a way of them hinting, don't think anything is true in this newspaper because even the name is not true. I don't know if that's the reason, but that's what they call Emes. So whenever there's a Bureau of Truth and Information, you can rest assured someone wants to control your mind. So what's the greatest freedom of all is to ask questions, to challenge. The whole Talmud is based on that. No one is immune to challenge. The greatest scholars, Rabbi Akiva, the greatest Tanoim, they said something, a colleague, a student, another colleague questioned it, challenged it. It says a different verse in a different context, and the counter-challenge, and counter-challenge, and it never ends actually. You go through the commentaries, and you go through the generations, they're all challenging and challenging and challenging. Obviously all in good spirit and in a healthy way, because there's nothing as free as questions. So perhaps that's the story with the 4 questions. It's not so much about the answer. It's knowing that you have the right to ask questions. Teaching our children, you can ask questions. You will not be silenced. You have the right to ask. Not only kishach, you should ask. And we will respond, and we'll try our best. So maybe that's the hint, that it's not so much about the answer. Shailas chacham chetzi tshuva. The question of a wise person is half an answer. If you're asking the question, you're already on your way to the answer. So that resonates with me as a better reason why not necessarily every question has to be answered, but every question has to be asked. And as the Baal Shem Tov says, for every question I have an answer, for every answer I have another question. So even if you answered it, there's always going to be more questions anyway. So that's another expression of transcendence and freedom. So God bless you all. Always have your minds open. Free inquiry. Ask questions. Obviously healthy questions, as in healthy skepticism is you want an answer. Unhealthy skepticism is just an excuse. Asking questions to just justify your position, which obviously doesn't have the same type of intellectual honesty. So we will have another class next week. It'll be another pre-Passover. I'll speak more about the actual Seder and so on. But this was a first step toward that. So everyone, if I don't see you before Passover, have a very healthy and happy and kosher Passover. And until next week, it's been an honor to meet some of you, new people, and to share a few words about transcendence, the 3 vital lessons of transcendence. Emptying yourself and empathy. Be well. Good night.